Nuclear power. It is, well, it's both the solution to and cause of many of life's problems when you're a naval officer. And historically, it's a rather new invention as far as naval power is concerned. But it's also something which has to be considered because it's been around a lot longer than we might think. In fact, the first forays to nuclear power are debated because they are, of course, there are the official forays into them, and there's the fact that those official forays have a surprisingly large amount of data to draw from, considering they're supposed to be the first forays. So the debate as to when people start looking into nuclear power generation for ships, most historians would tell you that the documentary evidence we can find starts off in the 1940s. My strong suspicion is that the early ideas about it probably started up with the early ideas of nuclear power in the first place, which is probably 30s, 20s time. There is sort of always that period of people going, that looks interesting. That looks interesting. Tell me more. Tell me more. And then after a while, there's a case of, right then, let's see if this will work. And again, your first approach tends to be somewhat covert, because if you can get ahead of the curve, steal a march on everyone else, so when you implement it, if everyone starts implementing, you're implementing it better and more viably than everyone else, that's hugely advantageous. But honestly, the two big powers looking into it, the two really big powers looking into it, are Britain and America. In the 20s and 30s. I know. After World War II and during the Cold War, we usually can, whenever it comes to nuclear, we sort of go, well, it's either going to be the Soviet Union or it's going to be America. Occasionally with France jumping in and Britain also turning up in terms of submarines. But the fact is, in the 20s and 30s and the early 40s, if you're talking about it, and the 40s even after World War II, the initial 40s after World War II, you are talking about Britain and America. There aren't any other powers with the, how do I put this politely, the incentive to investigate nuclear power. Because it is going to be expensive. It is always expensive. It is always expensive. I have the WD-40 arrives soon. And because it's so expensive, it's something which you have to think through carefully before you do. But there is a reason I have written this, more than just Rickrover, because the moment you get into development of nuclear power, one name starts to dominate the conversation. Rickrover. Honestly, you cannot overstate his impact. You cannot overstate his capacity for work. But you can also not overstate the facts that this most powerful of officers, when he is brought down, he's brought down by a combination of politicians who are jealous of his power, politicians who didn't understand his value, and the military-industrial complex, and to an extent in that there was at least one company which was under severe investigation. It's one of those interesting things. When you start talking about it, people go, oh, I thought the American problems with submarines was something new and recent. Oh no, they've had issues over the years. And it makes you worry about other submarine manufacture going on out around the world if the Americans have had the issues they've had on the regular level they've had. And you have to remember, the Americans have had those big issues. They have still not had anywhere near as many reactor events, touch wood, submarines having all sorts of issues, touch wood, as the Russians have. Even to an extent another nuclear submarine operator has had. Now, before getting too much, shameless book plug, and the reason this video is being delayed, well, there's two reasons. One, I wanted to, I didn't realise Haida was going up today on Naval's channel, and it's good. It was a lot of fun, and again, I want to reiterate how much fun it was to go with him. How much fun it is to work as in that group of four, of Dan, Gareth, Drac and myself. It's a lot of fun doing things together, and hold tight because new stuff is coming. I also wanted to quickly mention that you will notice that the Patreon Live for the 30th of March has now been scheduled, the bonus one, and that has gone because I went to a topic which cumulatively has some of the most votes of any topic from last year, in that it never won once at all, but the Diesel Kriegsmarine of Carl von Gasberg, which he has put forward every month for about, I think it must be about 18 months, solidly, has in that time managed to accrue somewhere in the region of 212 votes over that period. It could be the same people are voting for it every time, but it's had a lot of support, and so that is the one which has won. Because it also seems fair. And that's basically what I do, is I go to the ones which didn't win, and I added up from the last year. I actually extended it back because this is the first time I've done this. I did sort of slightly more than a year. And I did a nice little Excel spreadsheet, and I added in their votes from every month, of what, if they got same topics or similar topics, again, and combine them together. And yeah, Diesel Kriegsmarine has won. And finally, well, I think the shameless book plug has been working, because I had an interesting email, and I might be getting, well, rather my book, my first book, might be getting reprinted. So a second edition might be coming out. And that's all thanks to you. The fact that I can do all the stuff I'm doing, all the naval history I'm doing, all these things, is thanks to you. So thanks again to everyone who is a watcher of the videos. Thank you to everyone who does super thanks, super chats, all those things. Thank you to everyone who's a subscriber, who's a member of the channel. Thank you to everyone who's a patron. That ongoing, for want of a better phrase, infusion of funds or income is really critical to doing all the stuff I do. So thank you. To nuclear power. Let's start off with, so why go nuclear? Why go nuclear? Well, advantages. Very long range. Refueling is measured in years, not miles. Theoretically low fuel costs. No space is taken up by fuel, nor are exhaust stacks or intakes required, which makes designing the ship so much more simple. And huge amounts of power for systems and speed, so whilst this wasn't one of the original calculations, it's certainly one of the calculations that's been considered, that you can really pump out the power on radar. You could really pump out the power in lasers. We've discussed this a few times on Build Trumps. But there are some technologies available which we just can't make use of because we cannot store the necessary amount of power in order to really use them efficiently and make them effective. If if you had used a nuclear reactor, you wouldn't need to store the power. You could generate it. Even with marine reactors. Disadvantages though, very high operating costs and infrastructure costs. It's, again, if you need a lesson drummed home, you have to look at the current AUKUS scenario, and I have no idea when you'll be watching this video, so you might not know what AUKUS is, but it's an alliance between Australia, the United States, and the United Kingdom. Hence, AU, okay, US, Australia, United Kingdom, United States. And it's to allow Australia to develop and deploy its own nuclear submarines. Great! There are a lot of people who are going, that's an eye-watering cost. Well, the Australia is facing 3 different uphill struggles. One, they stopped producing submarines 3-4 decades ago, it feels like. And they should have kept the submarine system in low rate production to keep a yard running and capable of producing submarines in the first place. 2 of those submarines were diesel submarines, so they have none of the infrastructure in place for nuclear submarines. And combined with all that, problem number 3, they're going to have to rectify all of this to be able to get to the angle, which is going to be expensive. And that's the way the SSK program was going to be. Well, they're basically trying to turn a small nuclear submarine into a diesel submarine, and that wasn't really working out that well. It's expensive. It's really expensive. Honestly, I'm not sure if Britain and France were looking at the cost today of actually building nuclear power houses without having already got a sizable amount of infrastructure already in place, and the ability to produce these things already in place, whether either nation would actually be doing it. I think it's a really interesting discussion going on at the moment in France about future carrier proposals and whether they're going to be nuclear powered or not. And it was a really interesting discussion in Britain about whether or not our carriers, when they were looking at the various options for carriers for the Queen Elizabeth class before defining on the design they did for, there were people talking about a nuclear counterpart carrier. But you save money by having a far wider array of aircraft you could procure for your air wing, and of course you could get the Hawkeye and various other systems, which are a great advantage. But the cost is also massive. The operating cost, the training of the crew, and the retention of the crew is massive, because what you have to remember is that the nuclear civilian industry will pay a huge amount of money for the people who have the qualifications that they earn in the Navy. And so, whereas you don't tend to have much of an external market competing for your... I'm going to say this in the nicest way. An infantryman has a lot of skills and is a very skilled and has to be very highly trained soldier. However, their skills are not quite as in the same level of demand as a nuclear engineer is. In fact, even a pilot's skills, flying aircraft, which airlines are always happy to take, ex-Naval Air Service, Army Air Corps or Royal Air Force pilots, and same with any nations, they're always happy to get them. The Navy actually has to watch out for their nuclear engineers getting headhunted while they're in the service. So nuclear engineers are a special breed. And this is all a factor. Now, what you also have to add on to the fact is the no fuel internally, other than necessarily what you have for aircraft, also has an impact on your supply ships, your logistics ships. So that's another factor you have to think about it, and the cost of protecting those ships. However, you also, when you're building a nuclear reactor into a ship, you tend to want to protect it. if we consider one of the more bigger ships, which we talk about in a bit, that ship basically only qualifies to an extent as a battle cruiser because it is fitted with armor, but that armor is all around its reactor. Sensible. The reason you're putting it on the reactor, though, and around that area, is not just to protect it from outside threats, but also give you an internal containment position. So, these are the factors that go into nuclear. It has all these advantages, but disadvantages are basically massive cost. Massive cost. And you only have so much money. I know. Should really look into getting a Steam Deck. For this and for OBS when I'm doing Twitch, but we'll see. We'll see. So, merchant ships. As rather no surprise then, they are rather rare. As nuclear-powered vessels go, there have been 4. Other than icebreakers. Icebreakers are slightly more common. And the Savannah was the first. That was an American-built vessel. Very interesting vessel. Very interesting vessel. But that was an American vessel. There is only one still in service as a nuclear-powered merchant ship. The Severmorput. And if you've read Red Storm Rising, which is quite an interesting book in some ways, and often serves as a good basis for a interesting discussion. You will know they're on there. There is a ship which can load and offload lighters. You can carry dozens of them, and that's how they do an amphibious assault on Iceland. And basically, lighters like that are used in where you have port facilities which are not really the greatest port facilities, or whether you're going to often have issues with the port facilities. It's still in service because, again, when you're doing the Northern Run and various other things, having a ship which is nuclear powered and which has the ability to carry a number of lighters it does is very useful. It has required extensive maintenance over the years. Really absurdly long times of maintenance. It's one of those scenarios which you sort of look at and go, this must be a very interesting business model that it can support, that a private company can support this cost. But I suppose if it's your only real viable option for what you need to do, you pay it. Now, most of the reactors that have ever gone to sea, vast majority of them, are pressurized water reactors, which are some of the most basic and easy to contain reactors that you've got. If you look at this, this is the land. This is actually the pile from the Savannah. And another thing about, basically, they sometimes call them small reactors, etc., for ships and modular power reactors, because they're very much they're not as the high yield, massive, vast quantities of power which are produced by civilian reactors offshore. These are reactors tuned to their environment and the realities of where they're operating. But they still operate often on a similar system, where they will have the reactor vessel, they'll have one amount of water going around, it's pressurized water, will be going around to stop it sort of turning to steam. It's kept under pressure. And that, to keep that water from, radioactive water from getting out and around the rest of the ship, that water doesn't actually go anywhere. That's in a closed loop. It never gets out. That water feeds into another circuit of water, which is what's turned into steam. And also powers the turbine, which powers the generator, or drives the engine and propeller. And that is what then, that water then goes to the condenser, cools down, and goes around again. And most nuclear submarines, most nuclear ships, most everything has used this system. It's all about controlling that reaction, because an uncontrolled reaction is otherwise known as a bomb when it comes to nuclear power. But a controlled reaction is probably the most powerful thing you can do, second only to harnessing the sun. If you could harness the sun, you'd be very, very, very powerful. Ultimately, it's all about trying to give you the power on demand as soon as you can get it. Which is where, well, Rickrover comes in. Rickrover personally stamped his authority on pretty much every facet of the American nuclear program. He built up tremendous power. He built up tremendous capability. He personally interviewed pretty much every officer that was going anywhere near his reactors. And he selected the people who interviewed all the NCOs and enlisted. I did not recruit extraordinary people. I recruited people who had the extraordinary potential, and then I trained them. He was obsessed with safety. This upset many, and it's no surprise that since his downfall, everyone else who's held his post has been from the operations side. So we'll properly balance things on operational needs rather than safety needs of cancelling operations because that's not safe. No, no, no. They'll listen to the operations argument. You need both. You honestly do need both, and I can understand where they're coming from. With Rickrover, I can understand where they found it annoying, but for all his faults, and he has many, he didn't really bother to explain himself as much as he possibly could have to have got extra support. And he wasn't really as good at playing the political game as he necessarily felt he was. He was very, at his strongest point, he's also at his weakest, because he doesn't realise his weakness because of his strength. And the thing is, once you become powerful enough, you can shake the politicians. The politicians don't want you. I do love the fact that he put on full uniform to go and tell Regan to basically bog off. In different linguistics, Regan's defense secretary got rid of him. Regan realised it was an issue, called him to try and make him his nuclear advisor, and told him to he went in what to do. The White House in full uniform told him to bog off. He wasn't going to be window dressing for anyone. Safety was his big thing. He developed nuclear power with an ironclad focus on safety. Doesn't seem to like, well, how do I put this, like getting involved much with the surface fleet. Probably because he had a massive amount of control over the subsurface fleet. And he was even able to interview all prospective aviators who were going to become captains of aircraft carriers, etc. But when it comes to the surface fleet and the nuclear-powered cruisers, those appear to be an area where he was less enamoured with. Which is strange, because you would have thought they would have been a natural area of inclination for him, considering his background. But no, it wasn't the case. You know, he had been a destroyer officer. He'd served on board battleships. And he'd served on submarines as well, but, you know, he was an experienced, very capable officer who had achieved a great deal of decoration in wartime. The fact is, he gets, and I have to admit this, is, you know, whilst he does full duty politics, he retained his post-duty politics. He hadn't been promoted to Rear Admiral when he was captain, so he was due to retire out, and it's a political pressure and political campaign which gets him promoted, and it's political campaign which gets him promoted above and above that. And the fact is, he promoted Admiral on the retired list so that they can tell everyone, no, we haven't exceeded our maximum quota of admirals. Which causes even more fun. The big thing for Rickrover was responsibility. That is what he emphasises in pretty much everything. And I have had the joy of meeting with, working with, and teaching people, disturbing enough, who worked with Rickrover, who met him. And they always list responsibility. They always think about, mention responsibility when talking about Rickrover. He was hugely into personal responsibility. Trouble is, he did think he was responsible for the entire nuclear vessel program in the United States Navy, and that tended to cause issues because sometimes he interpreted that as responsibility as he was in charge of all those ships and they all belonged to him. But here is the first special, the Nautilus. Now, if we go back to this submarine, what's an advantage of a submarine being nuclear powered? Well, refueling not necessary, massively long range. You no longer have to worry about running out of fuel or your batteries failing because you've got nuclear reactors. If anything goes wrong with them, it's probably going to be a case of you're not going to have to worry about anything else in life. So, you know, the nuclear reactors are fine. No space is taken up by fuel, nor are exhaust stacks or air intakes required. Helpful, you don't have to surface to charge the batteries or anything like that. Also, space is at a premium on a submarine, so anything which allows you to use space more efficiently, even if an engine is larger, because it's a nuclear reactor, if you don't have to have fuel and you don't have to have the piping for fuel, that makes life a little bit better. Huge amounts of power for systems. Ooh, that's good. Because let's be honest, creating air and other things underwater, that requires a lot of energy. And also, look at some of the disadvantages. Well, the disadvantages are all about cost, and if you're building a long-range super submarine anyway, that's already going to be expensive. Doesn't matter whether it's diesel-powered or nuclear-powered, it's going to be expensive. It is going to be expensive. But still, they went there with the Nautilus. SSN 571. That's its reactor going down. The problem came when they tried it in the Seawolf, and then, well, Rickrover ended up delivering this. This is for 575 USS Seawolf. Not long after Nautilus, Although makeshift repairs permitted the Seawolf to complete initial sea trials on the reduced power in February 1957, Rickrover had already decided to abandon the sodium-cooled reactor. Early in November 1956, he'd informed the Commission that he would take steps towards placing the reactor in the Seawolf with a water-cooled plant similar to that of the Nautilus. The leaks in the Seawolf steam plant were an important factor in that decision, but even more unpersuasive was the inherent limitation in sodium-cooled systems. In Rickrover's words, they were expensive to build, complex to operate, susceptible to prolonged shutdown as a result of even minor malfunctions, and difficult and time-consuming to repair. This is one of the reasons why you have so many pressurized water reactors. Because of Rickrover, because of his opinions, but also because of the experience of operating a Seawolf versus a Nautilus. It's not nice. It's an issue. And yes, those reactors and our knowledge and understanding of those reactors have improved. They have got better over time. But it's still, how do I put this politely? It's still largely kept to the most simple system we can use. Why? Because you have to maintain it. Nuclear power has a lot of advantages, but it's also one of those technologies that if you too fancy, you are going to end up causing yourselves more trouble than you want. Because you don't want to muck around with radiation. You do not want to muck around with nuclear power. You muck around with it, it can go boom. You need to be sensible of it. Sensibly harnessed, nuclear power can be very, very useful. So, keeping, Rickrover, although I doubt he would ever use the phrase himself, seems to have applied the entire time, and it seems to have swept into the wider, at least the wider Western nuclear powers, keeping it simple. Keep it simple. Keep it simple. Keep it simple. Does for all the extra things it can potentially offer, is it worth it? No. Considering how much you're spending on pressurized water reactors anyway, if you're calling some of the systems expensive, then it's extortionate. Now, these are of course the most famous nuclear powered surface combatants in the world, but I've done a whole series on American nuclear cruisers. Basically, they make a lot of sense for both sides. For one side, if you're going to have nuclear-powered aircraft carriers, you really should have a nuclear-powered escort for each of them. So that they can have at least one escort which can keep up with them when they're doing high-speed runs and they're operating around the world. Yes, the rest of the battle group probably won't be able to keep up with them, and that'll be annoying, but in transit periods, when you're rushing from one theatre to another theatre, having something that can go that fast is useful. And keep up with you, that's great. And that is what the Americans largely had. They had these nuclear-powered cruisers, which were just beautiful. They were very, very effective and capable vessels. For the Soviet Union, nuclear power gives you a different advantage. Now, there are many, many ideas which go around about these ships, and again, I've done a whole video on the Kirov class, so I'm not going to go into massive detail on it. But my often inclination, and the perspective I have put forward a few times, is that they are the ultimate surface radar. They're the ultimate, we can go anywhere, any time we want vessel, and we can therefore apply pressure wherever we need to. They're also great task group command ships. They're great fleet operations ships. They are great for anti-submarine, anti-aircraft work for the Soviet Navy. They are wonderful vessels for them to build. And finally, they're huge statement pieces. They are absolutely colossal statements of, we're here. How scared are you feeling right about now? But again, they are a response to that. They are a response to nuclear carrier battle groups. You know, you've got the US Navy sailing around entire task groups of nuclear-powered ships. Long Beach, Bainbridge, and Enterprise. In that period, that task group is not something anyone really wants to come across. Because those ships are going to be able to keep doing whatever they need to do as long as they have firepower. So as long as their weapons work and they still have reloads for their missiles, they're fine. Food and missiles. That's all they need, really. Add in some shells. But again, think about that logistically, how that reduces your needs. That task group is one of the fastest moving task groups in the American forces. So fast that honestly their supply ships probably can't keep up with them and they probably have to go back to them. Which would create its own fun, but leave that to one side. What do those supply ships need to give them? Aviation fuel? Yep. Food? Yep. Ammunition? Yep. That it? Yep. It's a very capable group. It really is. So this is an introduction to nuclear power. And I thought about doing a summary, but again, it would be exactly the same thing as I put here. So instead I'll go back to this point. Why go nuclear? Why didn't more nations go nuclear? Well, it's the cost. It is the cost. It's purely a cost reason for why didn't more nations then go nuclear. Plus, you have to be able to justify it. So it's cost-benefit rather than just pure cost. It's what's the benefit of going nuclear? I know some of the analysis that probably went into the Queen Elizabeth class carriers was probably still teamed with full of stuff of we are now entering the war of choice period. We're now going to be peaceful forevermore. The Cold War is over. Long live peace. And you can tell that because they built 2 units rather than 3 or 4. To replace 2 units, to replace Invincible, Ark Royal, Illustrious, Ocean, and Argus. 2 vessels to replace 5. Just covering a grimace there. It's not smart, it's not sensible, and it's not the clever thing to do. But it's what happens. It's what happens when you're having to make a rational choice between what do you fund as a government. Do you raise taxes? That can give you income in the short term, but in the long term that takes money out of the economy, which stops people reinvesting it, which stops the economy growing. So you've got to balance that. Secondly, do you cut spending elsewhere? Well, what do you cut spending in? Education? That's not good, because to actually support nuclear-powered vessels, as Rickrover would tell you, you need a very educated, highly educated group. In fact, he gave this quote: "There is no room here in nuclear power plant development for lofty theories which do not work out in practice. We would not get anywhere if we had the loose, hazy thinking you encounter when you bring out the obvious failures of the American educational system. There are times when it's irresponsible to avoid criticizing something which is one knows to be wrong and dangerous for the nation as a whole. I feel that everyone who has a position of responsibility in the country and who can see and understand what is happening not only has the right, he has the obligation and duty to ask. This is why I feel so strongly about education, about our failure to give our children as good an education as they deserve and need. It's my considered opinion that there is no problem that faces the Congress or the country that is as important." Mm-hmm. Can't really cut education spending because education is part of the infrastructure needed for nuclear power. Then there's health spending. Probably not a good idea. Okay. What about civilian infrastructure? No, you don't want to cut spending on that because that will also cause self-issues. You can go on. You can go through the list. You've got to make a judgment call. What do you cut? What do you save? What do you raise? Do you borrow? Do you go for that old wheeze? That's fine. We'll borrow this money, but don't worry. The future generations will have to pay it off. But it means we don't have to make any tough decisions. It's brilliant. Doesn't work long term, but it's a brilliant idea politically. It's brilliant. It's kicking a problem down the road. Do you have needs range-wise? Well, it depends. Where do you think your carriers or your surface ships, submarines are going to operate? If they're just going to sit off your shore and basically be a submerged minefield, then you might as well build diesel submarines. If they're not going to go for that far off your shore and operate like that, then you might as well build diesel submarines. If you're going to be deploying them a long way away, and if you're going to deploy them as part of allied task group and task force organizations, then you probably want something which is nuclear powered. Partially for status, but mostly for the capability of actually being there. But you've got to make the judgment call, because that's going to be an expensive judgment. And I hope I've mentioned expensive enough times to really drive it home. But nuclear power. It's cool, but use a pressurized water reactor. We've got blockading Brest on Thursday. And then next week we have, as I mentioned, we have the Diesel Cruise Marine. And the week after that, well, I'm off teaching in London. So there are going to be some key ship series, which are going to be explained when they go live. I hope you're going to enjoy them. Thank you very much for watching. And today's question is, if you could pick any group of ships in World War II to make nuclear powered, which ones would you pick and why? Interesting to hear. Thank you very much for watching. Take care. Hope you have a nice evening, and take care.